There's a feeling some people carry that doesn't show up in their resume. They've done well, sometimes very well. They've checked the boxes, hit the milestones, earned the recognition. From the outside, it looks like proof of worth. But inside, there's something else. A quiet sense that none of it counts, that no matter what gets accomplished, there's still something fundamentally wrong. Not with what they do, but with who they are. It's not always loud. It doesn't always interrupt daily life. But it's there in the background, like static. A feeling that love is something other people experience naturally, and for them, it has to be earned. And even then, it never quite sticks. Achievement feels necessary, but it also feels empty. There's a brief moment after something goes well, a promotion, a compliment, a finished project, where it seems like maybe this time it will be different. Maybe this will be the thing that makes them feel solid. It never is. The praise lands, but it doesn't sink in. It sits on the surface. And underneath, the feeling stays the same. So they try again. They do more. They get better. They become the person others admire. And still, privately, they wonder why it doesn't feel the way they thought it would. They look around and see people who seem at ease with themselves, people who rest without guilt, people who seem loved without having to constantly prove something. And they can't figure out what those people have that they don't. It's confusing, because from the outside, everything looks fine, sometimes better than fine. But on the inside, there's this persistent sense of being behind glass, visible, but not quite reachable, capable, but not quite enough. And the question that sits quietly beneath it all is this: what if I'm just not the kind of person who gets to feel loved? This feeling didn't appear out of nowhere. It started early, in the years when we're learning what love is and how it works. And for some people, what they learned was that love wasn't just given. It had to be earned, not always in obvious ways, not always through cruelty or neglect. Sometimes it was quieter than that. Maybe love showed up when they did well in school, when they were helpful, when they made things easier for the adults around them, and when they weren't those things, the warmth pulled back. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. So they learned to watch, to read the room, to figure out what was needed and become that. Achievement became a strategy, not because they were ambitious, but because it worked. It brought approval. It brought safety. It made them visible in a way that felt like being valued. But here's what happens when love feels conditional. You start to believe the condition is the reason, that without it, there's nothing worth loving underneath. You don't think of it that way at the time. You just know that being good at things makes life easier. That being useful means being wanted. That if you stop producing, you might stop mattering. Some people grew up in homes where emotions were inconsistent. Warmth one day, distance the next, with no clear reason why. So they became students of other people's moods. They learned to manage, to adjust, to stay small or helpful or impressive, depending on what the moment required. It wasn't manipulation. It was survival. And the strategy worked. They got through. They became capable. They learned how to succeed in ways that kept them safe. But the cost was this. They started to believe that their worth was tied to what they could do, not who they were. That's not a character flaw. It's an adaptation, a reasonable response to an environment that didn't offer unconditional safety. The problem is that the adaptation doesn't stop when the environment changes. Even years later, even after building a life that looks stable and successful, the old logic stays in place. The belief that love is something you earn, that rest is dangerous, that if you stop performing, you'll be left behind. And so the feeling of being unlovable persists. Not because it's true, but because it was learned early and reinforced often. It became the baseline, the assumption beneath everything else. Most people don't realize this is what's happening. They just know they feel empty after achievements that should feel good. They know praise doesn't land the way it seems to for others. They know they're tired in a way that rest doesn't fix, and they assume the problem is them, that they're broken or ungrateful or incapable of satisfaction. But they're not. They're just carrying a belief system that was built in childhood and never updated. A system that says your value is conditional. You have to keep proving it, and no amount of proof will ever be enough to change what you believe about yourself at the core. That's where the feeling comes from. Not from failure, not from lack of effort, from a time when love felt like something you had to earn, and the quiet, persistent fear that you still haven't earned enough.
The belief doesn't announce itself, it just quietly shapes everything. For people who learned early that love is conditional, achievement stops being one part of life. It becomes the center, the thing that holds everything else together. Their identity gets built around what they do, what they produce, what they can point to as evidence that they matter. And on the surface, this works. They become competent, reliable, the person others turn to. They build careers, meet goals, earn respect. But underneath, there's no off switch, because if your worth is tied to what you accomplish, then stopping feels dangerous. Rest starts to feel like evidence of laziness. A weekend without productivity feels like wasted time. Even small moments of doing nothing can trigger a low-grade panic that's hard to name. So they keep moving, not because they love what they're doing, but because not doing it feels worse. The finish line keeps moving too. They hit a goal and feel nothing. Or they feel something briefly and then it fades, and they're back to the same baseline emptiness. So they assume the goal wasn't big enough. They set a new one. They push harder. But the problem isn't the size of the goal. It's that achievement was never designed to fill the gap they're trying to fill. Praise becomes strange. When someone compliments them, it doesn't land. It feels like the person is talking about someone else, or it feels conditional, like it only applies as long as they keep performing at that level. So they smile, they say thank you, but internally, they're already thinking about what's next, what they need to do to keep that approval in place. Because deep down, they don't believe the praise is about them. They believe it's about what they've done. And what they've done can always be undone. This makes relationships complicated. They show up for people, they're dependable, they help. But it's hard for them to just be with someone without also being useful. They struggle to ask for things, to be vulnerable, to let someone see them when they're not at their best. Because the logic they learned says, people stay because you're valuable, and value comes from what you offer, not who you are. So they become the friend who always listens but never shares, the partner who solves problems but doesn't express needs, the colleague who takes on extra work because saying no feels like risking rejection. And over time, this creates a specific kind of loneliness. They're surrounded by people, they're liked, maybe even admired, but they feel unseen, because the version of themselves that others know is the high-functioning one, the capable one, the one who has it together. The part of them that feels lost or tired or unsure stays hidden, because that part doesn't seem safe to show. There's also this. They become very good at reading what's expected and delivering it. In meetings, they know what to say. In social settings, they know how to act. They can shift depending on the room, the role, the audience. It's not dishonest, it's just automatic. But after a while, they start to lose track of what they actually want, what they actually feel, because so much energy has gone into managing how they're perceived that there's not much left for figuring out who they are underneath all of it. And then there's the exhaustion, not the kind that comes from working hard, the kind that comes from constant self-surveillance, always monitoring, always adjusting, always making sure they're enough. It's like running an internal auditing system that never stops. Every interaction gets reviewed, every mistake gets catalogued, every moment of rest gets questioned. They can't relax because relaxing feels like letting their guard down. and letting their guard down feels like risking the one thing they've built their safety on, being good enough to keep. So they stay in motion, they stay useful, they stay capable, and they stay lonely. Because the life they've built is full of proof that they matter, but empty of the feeling that they do. They look successful, they might even be successful, but success didn't solve the problem it was supposed to solve. It didn't make them feel loved. It didn't make them feel safe. It didn't quiet the voice that says they're still not enough. And the confusion that comes with that, the gap between what their life looks like and what it feels like, can be one of the hardest parts. Because if you're doing everything right and still feel this way, it starts to seem like the problem isn't the strategy. It starts to seem like the problem is you. When this pattern goes unnamed, it doesn't just stay the same. It deepens. Not all at once, not in a way that's easy to notice while it's happening. But over months and years, something starts to shift. The feelings get quieter, not because they've resolved, but because they've been pushed down so many times that they stop surfacing as clearly. People describe it as numbness, a flatness that settles in where intensity used to be. Good things happen and they register cognitively, but not emotionally. A promotion comes through and the first thought is about the next thing, not the accomplishment itself. A compliment lands and gets filed away as noise. It's not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look similar. It's more like a slow dimming, a gradual distance from their own emotional life. And the strange part is, from the outside, nothing looks wrong. They're still showing up, still performing, still managing. In some cases, they're performing better than ever, because achievement is the one thing that still feels like solid ground. But on the inside, there's a growing sense of disconnection. They're admired, but they feel alone. People respect them, rely on them, seek them out, but the loneliness doesn't ease, because the connection they're getting is based on what they do, not who they are. And somewhere deep down, they know that. They know that if they stopped being useful, stopped being competent, stopped delivering, the attention would shift. The warmth would pull back. So they can't let anyone too close, not really. Even in relationships that look intimate, there's a part of them that stays behind the glass, watching, managing, making sure the version of themselves that's visible is the one that's acceptable. And that distance creates its own kind of grief, because they want to be known. They want to be loved for something other than their resume, but they don't know how to let that happen without risking the structure they've spent years building. The exhaustion compounds too. Not just physical tiredness, though that's part of it. It's the tiredness that comes from living in a constant state of low-level vigilance, always monitoring how they're coming across, always adjusting, always second-guessing whether they've done enough, said the right thing, met the invisible standard. It's like running background software that never stops. And over time, it drains them in ways they can't fully explain. They might sleep enough and still wake up tired. They might take a vacation and come back feeling just as heavy. Because the exhaustion isn't about needing rest. It's about the fact that rest doesn't turn off the internal pressure. Even when they're alone, even when no one's watching, the system is still running. The self-surveillance doesn't stop. And so they start to lose access to their own desires. Not big desires like career goals or life milestones. Those are clear because they've been tied to achievement. But smaller things, what they actually enjoy, what brings them ease, what they want in a moment when there's no expectation attached. They've spent so long figuring out what's expected that they've stopped checking in with what feels true. So when someone asks what they want to do or what sounds good or how they're really doing, the answer doesn't come easily. Because they've trained themselves to prioritize function over feeling. And feeling, when it does show up, gets filtered through the lens of whether it's productive or appropriate or worth taking up space with. There's also a quiet grief that starts to accumulate. grief over the fact that the formula didn't work, that doing everything right didn't lead to the safety they were promised. They followed the rules, they worked hard, they became the kind of person others value, and it still didn't make them feel loved. That realization, when it comes, doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic collapse. It's more like a slow leak, a growing awareness that something is missing, that the life they've built, while impressive, doesn't feel like theirs, and they don't know what to do with that. Because the strategy they've used to survive is the same strategy that's keeping them stuck, and letting go of it feels like letting go of the only thing that's kept them safe. So they keep going, they keep achieving, they keep managing, but the cost keeps building. The numbness spreads, the loneliness deepens, the exhaustion becomes part of the baseline. And underneath it all, there's a question that sits unanswered. Not voiced often, maybe not voiced at all, but present. What happens if I stop? What happens if I'm not constantly proving my worth? What happens if I let someone see me without the achievements, without the competence, without the usefulness? The fear is that the answer is nothing, that without all of this, there's no reason for anyone to stay. And so they don't stop. They don't let anyone in. They don't name what's happening. And the cost of that silence is a life that looks full but feels hollow. A life built on the belief that love has to be earned, and the growing, quiet certainty that no amount of earning will ever be enough. That's a hard place to land. But there's something worth seeing here. The feeling of being unlovable wasn't something you chose. It was something you learned. In a specific context, at a specific time, for specific reasons that made sense then. And here's what matters. The belief that your worth is conditional isn't a truth about you. It's a conclusion you drew based on the information you had. A reasonable conclusion, a protective one even, but not a permanent one. Achievement was never the problem. The drive to do well, to build something, to contribute, none of that is wrong. The problem is what achievement was asked to do. It was asked to prove worth, to generate safety, to fill a gap that it was never designed to fill. Because worth isn't something that gets produced. It's not something you earn by doing enough or being enough or performing at a high enough level. It just is. That might sound abstract or too simple to mean anything, but stay with it for a moment. The feeling of being unlovable exists because somewhere along the way, you learn that love is a response to what you do, that it's conditional, that it can be withdrawn. And if that's what you learned, then of course, you'd spend your life trying to meet the condition. Of course, you'd tie your identity to achievement. Of course, rest would feel dangerous and praise would feel hollow. You were doing exactly what the situation required. But the situation has changed, even if it doesn't feel like it has. You're not a child anymore, dependent on others for survival. You're not in an environment where love only shows up when you're useful. The old logic is still running, but it's running on outdated information. And that's worth noticing. Not as a way to blame yourself for not updating sooner, but as a way to see that the belief system you're operating from was built for a version of your life that no longer exists. The feeling of being unlovable isn't about who you are. It's about what you were taught to believe about who you are. And beliefs can be questioned, not all at once, not by forcing yourself to think differently or trying to convince yourself of something you don't feel, but by creating a little space between the belief and the truth, by noticing when the old logic shows up, when you feel the pull to prove your worth, when rest feels like failure, when love feels like something you have to earn, and just observing it, not as evidence that you're broken, but as evidence that a very old pattern is still present. There's no urgency here, no need to fix it immediately or transform overnight. This is about awareness, not action, about seeing the difference between who you've had to be and who you actually are underneath all the strategies and adaptations. Because the part of you that feels unlovable isn't the core of who you are. It's the part that learned to protect itself by becoming invaluable. And it did its job. It kept you safe. It helped you survive. But survival and living aren't the same thing. Survival is about making it through, about staying functional, about doing what's necessary to avoid danger. Living is quieter than that. It's about presence, not performance. About being seen, not just admired. About mattering because you exist, not because of what you produce. And the shift from one to the other doesn't happen by achieving more. It happens by loosening the grip on the belief that achievement is what makes you worth keeping. You don't have to stop working. You don't have to become a different person. You just have to start questioning whether the story you've been telling yourself about your worth is actually true. Whether the people in your life are really only there because you're useful. Whether love is actually as conditional as it felt when you were young. Whether the version of you that's tired or uncertain or imperfect is really as unworthy of care as you've believed. These aren't questions with easy answers. And they're not questions you have to answer right now. But they're worth sitting with. Because the life you've built on the idea that you have to earn love is a heavy one. And you've been carrying it for a long time. There's no instruction here for what comes next. No steps to follow. No promise that things will feel different tomorrow. Just this. The feeling of being unlovable is not a reflection of reality. It's a reflection of what you were taught. And what was taught can be examined, gently, without rushing, without forcing. You don't have to believe you're lovable right now. You just have to be willing to consider that the reason you feel unlovable might not be because it's true. It might be because it's familiar. And familiar, over time, can start to feel like fact. But it isn't. You are not the sum of what you've accomplished. You are not only valuable when you're useful. You are not required to earn the right to take up space. And the part of you that's been running on the old logic, the part that's tired and vigilant and never quite at ease, doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to know that it's allowed to rest. That love, real love, isn't something you have to keep proving you deserve. It's something that exists independent of performance. And maybe, in time, that can start to feel true. Not because you forced it, not because you optimized your way into believing it, but because you gave yourself permission to stop treating your worth like something that needs to be defended. And let yourself be seen as you are, not as who you've had to be, but as who you've always been underneath.